what was leadership and what was church like in the first century. And we often take our modern church structures and just kind of read that into the New Testament. Well, they had, a senior pastor and an elder board and deacons, and it's just kind of really ironed out. And the more I looked into first century house church leadership, because that's all they met in houses. Churches were 20, 30, maybe 40 people, so we're talking like, well, we'd almost think of like a Bible study. And I found that the leadership structure, according to the New Testament, was a lot more diverse, messy, less ironed out than most people assume. In fact, a lot of people know this, but maybe some don't, that the word pastor as a noun referring to a leader in the church only occurs in one passage in the entire Bible. Ephesians 4:11 talks about, actually it's a combination. It's like a pastor teacher. The verb to pastor or to shepherd as applied to a leader, that's used a few more times. But, in our churches today, pastor is like the go-to title. Like you don't, unless you're like Catholic and you have priests or whatever, like typically it's like, you don't have a church unless you got a pastor, maybe several pastors, or certainly a lead pastor. And so we have these ironed out categories largely that revolve around the term pastor, when the New Testament just does not have that. You also have terms like elder, overseer. But even these terms, I was shocked to find out that in Paul's 13 letters, he only refers to elders or overseers in like 2. Well, elder twice in 2 different letters, and overseer in 3 different letters. Like the majority of his letters, he's writing to churches who have leaders in the churches, and he never even uses these terms. But he does use other terms like coworker, or he even describes leaders like or servant. That was fascinating when I did a word study on where and why does Paul ascribe the term servant to other people doing work in the church. In almost every case, he describes somebody who is doing leadership things, like Timothy or Titus or Epaphroditus or Epaphras, and some of these people, these names people are familiar with. But as I did research, it's like a lot of these people are doing like their church planting, they're founding churches, they're leaders in churches, they're doing leadership things, but they're never called like a overseer, a pastor, or elder. They're called a servant. So you have this kind of just conglomeration of ways in which Paul identifies leaders. So this is where I thought the book would be easy, because I would just say, okay, does Paul ever call a woman an elder, pastor, or overseer? And the answer is a qualified no. He does refer to one woman as an apostle, which is interesting. But he does call women, he does describe women by other terminology that when he describes men with the same terminology, they're clearly functioning as leaders. So that's where it just gets messy. I mean, I think we need to broaden our scope of questions we're asking when we're saying, what evidence is there that women were performing leadership roles in the church? So, yeah, that was a fun, that chapter. So it's chapter 4 in my book where I really open up leadership in church in the first century. And probably the most, as a scholar, I just love to do research and discover new things. And that was probably the most exciting researched chapter. And it took probably the longest, because I realized that there's like loads of scholars they specialize in just like first century Christian leadership. Like that's what they do. And there's all these debates going on with that in that world, so it was fun to kind of enter into that.